Okay, so we're starting. We're official now. So we are discussing Chapter 20, the end of Chapter 20, Causes of the Great Depression. And I think that I've graded all of the Unit 1 stuff, and I'll start on the Unit 2 stuff this weekend. See if I can get a little bit of a head start on that. Now, don't get distressed. I know that the Unit 2 stuff isn't really due until next Friday, but a lot of you have turned a little bit in, so I want to get a head start on that so I don't feel as far behind on the grading as I felt like I was in the first unit. So, all right, so we'll start with sharing the screen, of course. Got to make sure I don't put up your test accidentally. I was working on that before class. All right, so we had talked about the culture of the 20s, and we'll kind of wrap up that discussion with the W.E.B. Du Bois and the Niagara Movement section, and then we'll go back and talk a little bit more specifically about the causes of the Great Depression, and then we'll probably get into the New Deal. Oh, excuse me, just a little bit. I'm so sorry, but for whatever reason, the after effects of surgery are making me seriously nauseous today, so hopefully we'll see how this goes. All right, so NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and they keep the name because I realize that the C part is archaic at this point. However, I don't think most people even recognize what NAACP stands for, and people know it by its initials, so they haven't renamed it. And, you know, it's been that way for 100 years, so a little over 100 years. So they keep the name. Started by a group of people who founded something called the Niagara Movement. Sorry. And people in the Niagara Movement they were progressives who thought it was time to work on racial and ethnic equality. And they met in Niagara, New York, which is a border town between New York and Canada. And the reason they met there is it was illegal to have an interracial gathering in New York. So if they ended up getting in trouble, they were going to get arrested, then they could cross over the border into Canada where it wasn't illegal. So their goal was to push for more racial and ethnic equality. They ended up founding the NAACP. And the NAACP goal was the same, push for racial and ethnic equality. And they had a fairly specific goal during this era, which was, to push for a law to say that lynching was murder, to make lynching illegal. So, I mean, it wasn't their only goal, but it was a major goal of theirs during the time period. So sorry. All right. One of their leaders was a fellow named W.E.B. Du Bois. I forget what all the initials stand for. Probably on another day I would remember. But I know that it looks like it should be Dubois. Always, when I taught high school, kids would get mad at me. And I would tell them, well, you know, we anglicize people's names. It's what we do here. And I, of course, am not quite old enough to have known him, although I think he did die like the year after I was born. So, I mean, you know, maybe our paths could have crossed briefly, although I doubt he hung out in Joplin, Missouri. But I've seen several videos where they interview people who knew him, and they all say his name, Du Bois. So I'm pretty sure I'm certain of it. But he's from New York, and he is the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He studied at, I think it was Berlin School of Economics as well, internationally traveled, highly intellectual fellow. He wrote a book that you could read for your book review, which might be interesting for you. It's called The Souls of Black Folks, and it's really a collection of essays regarding information that current events during his lifetime. So it's his opinions. One of the things he talks about is his opinion of African American education versus that of Booker T. Washington. And that was kind of a big debate at the time period. But Du Bois has this idea that African Americans should participate in a plan he called the 10% plan, which sounds like how you get admitted to state schools in Texas, but it's not exactly what he was talking about. His thought was that rather than settling for an agricultural job, a trade job, that sort of thing, which this was his perspective. I'm not trying to be judgmental about those jobs. Certainly most people in my family have those jobs. I'm kind of seen as the odd one that went to college. But he said, you know, instead you should go to college, get as high a degree as you can, start a business, have a medical practice, have a law practice, and then hire people from your community so that that top 10% of people within the community would create an economic base in the community and bring everyone else up with them. So he's, you know, not unlike Marcus Garvey, believes that economic independence is going to be a key to equality. And unlike Marcus Garvey, he does think formal education is truly important. And he also, what else was I going to say? Formal education is truly important. Oh, integration. I apologize. So he thought that society should be fully integrated, and that if you, as an African American, were not receiving your rights, go to court. Go to court. You have 14th and 15th Amendment, primarily 14th protect you. You should go to court and sue for your rights and insist on them until you get them. And if you ever compare Du Bois to Booker T. Washington, one of the things you'll notice is their beliefs also kind of fit the region they're from. If you insist on your rights in the South when you're an African American during this time period, it might not go as well. I'm not saying it would go completely well for you in the North, but you probably would have a different reaction in the South. And also there's different economic opportunities in the South. So, but Du Bois is a very highly educated fellow. He did the first study on demographics of urban poverty. I think it was in Philadelphia, I know that it was. So he's a really interesting fellow. He'll edit the newspaper The Crisis, which is the NAACP newspaper, for a pretty long time period. The NAACP will also begin a legal fight during this era to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, which we'll talk about more in the next unit. And you probably remember that Plessy was the case that said separate but equal facilities were okay. And they're going to argue that separate makes it unequal. So that'll take a long time to get through the Supreme Court and be kind of an interesting process, maybe, to look at. As you reflect on it, certainly was infuriating in the process. But the goal of the Niagara movement and eventually the NAACP is to push for full integration and equality for African Americans, for people of all colors, or races, ethnicities, for full equality. And I guess that's probably all we need to say about that for the moment. As far as how much success did they have during this era? You know, the progressive era wasn't great about racial and ethnic equality. We've talked about that before. And they don't pass a law to declare lynching murder. So that isn't terribly successful. But they do get, they do get a start on the legal campaign a very good start on overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. So beginnings. During this time period, also, and the book talks about this very extensively, the Harlem Renaissance. So what happens during this era is the cultural outpouring in the Harlem area of New York City, which is ethnic neighborhood, primarily African American, and designed to be an emphasis on art, literature, and music of the African American community, which wasn't considered mainstream during the time period. And the NAACP sponsored contests to reward African American artists for their contributions and also make their contributions more well known. And this is an interesting and great success of the time period. And some of this was planned, some of this was pretty organic. Does lead to the prominence of the Cotton Club. And the book talks quite a bit about that, and probably ways that, well, I was going to say in terms I wouldn't necessarily use. They do have some slang terms in there that I probably wouldn't necessarily use. However, they were used during the time period. And the idea was that you wouldn't want to go to Harlem, you wouldn't want to live in Harlem, but you don't mind going to Harlem to be entertained. So it leads to segregation of the Cotton Club, which had been primarily an African American entertainment venue. And now that it becomes popular with white people, there are going to be nights where only white people can go, and African Americans are not allowed. So it's kind of interesting. And the book talks a lot, or not a lot, but a little about how that becomes a trendy place to go for upper middle class and upper class white people in New York City. Important artists of the time period would include Louis Armstrong, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, Bessie Smith, who at times was the highest paid entertainer in the United States, and Langston Hughes, who's my favorite poet. Everyone should have a favorite poet, right? My favorite poet, because he's from my hometown. Why not? We only have tornadoes, and I don't know what else we have from Joplin, Missouri. So Langston Hughes, and he was wise not to stay there very long, traveled around quite a bit, but he's a fairly prominent poet. He's a very prominent poet. If you ever have to look at poetry for an English class, I suggest, just humbly suggest, you look at his poetry. It reflects on inequalities of the time period, difficulties that people in poor, sometimes rural areas have to face, although he lived, as an adult in urban areas, but grew up all over the place, and certainly is commentary on the inequalities of society. But he does it in poetry, so it's very nicely done, well written, and he's also very concise, unlike me today. Bessie Smith was more of a singer. Louis Armstrong, I always assume if you know anybody from this time period, he's the one you know. And he was known primarily as a trumpet player during that time period, a very fine trumpet player. But I think people know him more from the What a Wonderful World song, which is probably the way his voice sounded, kind of the way mine sounds today. Only it's much more musical, I'm sure. So this will lead to African American music, art, culture becoming mainstream American, being integrated as you would expect. If you study this period and you study the literature, especially of this period, what you'll notice is it tends to be more focused on the African American male experience rather than female experience. Female writers during this time period are not, African American writers are not as lauded. They're not really put out there as much because some of their subject matter is a little rough and it talks about family life, and it may not always be complimentary to African American men. So the people who led the NAACP thought that it might not be good for the push for equality to have literature, prominent literature during that time period, that suggested that African American men didn't always treat their families well. So, and it was not supposed to be an emphasis that it was because they were African American men, but that was the way that the NAACP feared that Alice Walker and writers of that time period might be seen as commenting about how Black men are terrible, rather than the struggles that Black women had to endure to be successful, that sort of thing. And you guys have read novels and short stories and things. They're hardly ever about things that are happy. That's my critique or interpretation of literature, I guess, as somebody with a bachelor's degree in English who didn't teach it for very long. So take that for what it's worth. Usually the best writing is not about stuff that's happy. It's about stuff that's intensely personal and often sad. So my impression. All right. I don't know if there's anything else that I want to say about 20s culture during this time period, except it was really varied. It was really broad. Now, the means of obtaining culture were not. You know, it's not like it is now where you can program everything onto your phone or whatever you program things onto. So you can listen, you put things in your ears and just listen to whatever it is you want to. You know, they had the radio. They didn't have TV yet, but they had movies and print. But you had many options, and you had, because printing was cheaper, probably had more options than you had in a previous era. The radio gave you a few options of things to listen to. So cultural material, I suppose, was more widely available. It's going to lead to an argument about whether newer hip culture is better or not, the argument about old versus new, country versus city, Protestant versus Catholic, prohibition versus ending prohibition. Should we all assimilate? Should we all continue to hold some of our diverse characteristics? So this it's kind of a decade of argument. You know, how do we determine what is truly American culture, what is best for the United States, what makes us continue to improve, that sort of thing. And it also is accompanied with a Supreme Court that is okay with limiting freedom of speech, and a justice system that's okay with occasionally convicting people that they know aren't guilty just to make a point. So it's a weird decade. Plus, young people are flapping and older people are just working. And most people really just kind of want to work and get along and buy a house and buy a car and live their lives. So, and that leads to a lot of people maybe not participating in politics except for entertainment purposes, and maybe not paying attention to regulation of stock market. I don't know why normal people would pay attention to that anyway, but the stock market grew during this time period, the economy grows during this time period, and then of course there's a massive, massive crash. All right, I'm going to stop for just a minute to see if you have any questions. You guys have any questions? Plus I get to drink more water. All right. All right. I appreciate that. Thanks for checking in. I was on a Zoom meeting as a student yesterday, which was kind of, well, employee really more. And they asked questions and expected us to answer. So I felt yesterday the way I probably make you guys feel sometimes, like, just answer my question. Come on. But so I tried to answer questions yesterday and be a good student, but I don't know that I was. All right. So
Well, I kind of get it, because if you think about this class would normally be in a classroom.
yeah,
So you would normally be teaching to a bunch of still screens. You would be teaching
yeah,
to faces.
it's kind of weird. Yeah, and I know everything's kind of weird now too. But the thing that concerns me, I realize, because I've taught for it's like 31 years, I know you don't have to pay attention while you're in class. I'm well aware of that. And I would always tell younger students, like, if you're going to sit there and watch something on your phone, just don't sit next to an older person because it really irritates them. But, at home, you can click in, log out, that sort of stuff, and not pay attention at all. And I don't have a clue, so I don't know, if you need some additional help or, yeah, I don't know what people are getting, what they're not. I know there's the textbook and, there's notes and stuff. So hopefully you can go back and get it. But, I also hope, yes, we are going to go over the weekly question. I also hope that, you're able to get something a little bit from the lecture that's being presented. So, all right, let's talk about the weekly question. Sorry, I was catching up on roll there for just a second. We'll go back to that in a little bit. So, weekly question, and maybe this would be a good chance for you guys to put stuff in the chat. Yeah, I do think the tech is cool as well, the quiz. Okay, so weekly question and quizzes, all those are due next Friday. So the weekly questions from 18, 19, 20, and 21 are due next Friday. The quiz should be live on Wednesday, like at midnight, Wednesday, 12:01. Unless I programmed it wrong. I'll go back and look. And it should be good through Friday at midnight. So next week, next Friday is when all the stuff is due. And this quiz has 20 questions. So we'll see if that's better or worse. And then after that quiz, we'll decide if you liked the 10-question quiz or the 20-question quiz. We'll decide that. And yeah, technology is hugely important. I'm just not good at it. I'm sure I've told you my 80-year-old father has an online job and he makes fun of my tech skills all the time. So, it's bad when your 80-year-old father makes fun of your tech skills. All right, but I probably know more about no, I don't know that I know more about the Great Depression than he does. I bake better cookies. No, that's probably not true either. All right, my dad has many skills. It's good. All right, let's talk about the causes of the Great Depression. So, I will talk about some, but maybe you could also type some things in the chat or you could volunteer some ideas about causes of the Great Depression. So, what is good about the economy in the 1920s? What sectors seem to be going well from your understanding?
Well, I gotta say that I've never really been a fan of history,
Okay.
but back when I was in school, books were written back in the 60s.
Mhm.
So these updated books, they have different points of view and different opinions.
That is the
And
truth.
s- and so I'm really liking it now because back then it was okay, on this date this happened, this date this happened.
It is
And
very
now
different.
it's more event based and I find it a lot easier to follow.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying because, yeah, I grew up same era probably. I know I'm a little older than you, but all of our textbooks were probably written 50s and 60s as well. And yeah, interesting perspectives, to say the least. And really, yeah, not as much, probably more opinion and less fact, although stock market crash for sure was a problem. The stock market was going pretty well. More people were buying stocks than before, and it's because there were more corporations. So the part of the economy that's going pretty well is probably the corporate part of the economy, and we're talking manufacturing. And corporations would sell stock, you could invest in those corporations, and then if the corporation did well, you would also earn money, and you had, the corporation had a limited liability, so they wouldn't necessarily lose all of their money, and you wouldn't lose all of your money if you bought stock. So um, corporate funding, uh, stock market, definitely going well during this time period. But here's the thing. If you bought stocks back then, they didn't regulate how you bought stocks. So you could borrow money to buy stocks. And if you borrowed money to buy stocks, you had to have about 10% down. And you didn't have to have collateral. And I don't know, I know some of you definitely have had loans. Some of you have student loans. Those are dangerous, aren't they? But some loans require collateral, others don't. Collateral is something that you have that has value that if you don't pay your loan back, they take away. So if you see commercials about payday loans, they usually want you to have your car as collateral if your car is paid off or something. If you have a home improvement loan, sometimes your house is collateral. When you borrowed money to buy stocks, you could borrow money from the stockbroker, whom the stockbroker borrowed it from the bank, and there wasn't collateral required. So you could borrow 90% of what you wanted to spend on stocks. So people were pretty reckless with that investment because it's very much like margin trading, absolutely. Because you could not only borrow to buy the stock, you could borrow against the value of your stock without having to sell it. So this is like a really weird game of poker where everyone's playing with borrowed money. So I don't want to say everyone, but pretty much everyone is pretty reckless about how they buy and sell and trade stocks because they don't have enough of their own money in the game to feel like it's theirs if they lose it. So if you had $100, borrowed 900 for $1,000 worth of stock, if you lost all that stock, even though you lost $1,000, you felt like you lost 100 because that's all you really had to start with. Now, do you have to pay back that other 900? Ideally, yes. But if there's no collateral for the loan, maybe not. And will it mess up your credit? Yeah. Do you care? Maybe not during that time period. So a lot of people were doing reckless things like that. And banks weren't requiring collateral or regulating loans cautiously at all. So you've got stock market stuff going on, which is a mess. You have an unregulated stock trade, and that is a problem. The parts of the economy that were going well, again, were the manufacturing parts, especially anything related to the automobile industry, because everybody wanted to buy a car. They were making cars more affordable. You could buy a car on credit without collateral, that sort of thing. So we're sort of living in a little bit of a credit economy during that time period, much more so than we had before. We're also in the 20s. Advertising's really big, so people are buying stuff that they're told that they need that they don't really need. And we understand that as modern people because I know I have stuff I don't need, and my guess is you have a few things as well that for some reason we're convinced we need. I know I had high school students who, whenever they had a new iPhone or a new model of iPhone, they had to get it the first day. So, like, I thought that was interesting because those things are pricey, but we've sacrificed for what it is we think we need, or we borrow for what it is we think we need. So you have a lot of people in debt, which probably isn't a good start, and you have a lot of very loose credit or really just very few credit regulations at all. Excuse me. No, you're right. Technology ages out. Europe doesn't need us anymore. Oh, well, that's just sad. I wish someone needed us. I feel sad now. No, I know what you're saying. Um, no, and the market is so international now, and manufacturing's done in so many different places. Um, do you really, I know technology ages out quickly, but do you really think a teenager needs the most updated phone all the time? Because I'm just going to say that I don't. But anyway, back to business, perhaps, causes of the Great Depression. We also have some international economic issues. Economic issue number one, World War I, which we, of course, would refer to as the Great War, because they weren't planning on World War II. The Treaty of Versailles, aside from creating the League of Nations, which we won't join, also assessed a war debt to Germany of $33 billion. Germany could not afford to pay $33 billion. 33 billion. Yeah. You guys are talking about phone apps. Yeah, iPhone 6. Yeah. Yeah, your wife needed a new phone. Yeah, no. I get it. The apps quit. Okay. So the $33 billion war debt, Germany couldn't afford to pay. Now, Germany was supposed to pay that to nations that they had harmed during the war, primarily England and France. England and France's economy were pretty devastated by some of the damage of World War I. So Germany is supposed to loan some of its industrial regions to France for 20 years. So Germany is now going to be less productive, but I'm not feeling sorry for Germany. I'm just saying it's not a good plan. They take away one of the most productive regions of Germany, loan it to France, and then assess Germany the $33 billion reparation, which they can't pay. So because Germany can't pay that to England and France have borrowed money from the United States. So England and France can't repay the United States. So the United States gets frustrated because Germany is defaulting on its loans. So Germany refinances the loans to Germany, or excuse me, let me try again. The United States refinances the German loans to pay off the reparation. And then Germany defaults on those again. Their economy completely collapses. They get rid of their money altogether, start a new monetary system. So you've got an international economic issue. And you have the general problem in the United States of overproduction. And they usually, when history teachers talk about this, they combine it with underconsumption, but I guess it's kind of the same thing. So they didn't really regulate inventories very well. If you work for a company where you sell stuff, you know that your inventory generally is electronic. So, people buy stuff, it's taken out online with that fine technology that I don't understand, but is quite important. And then they know more exactly when they need to produce more products, so they're not just producing and guessing as much, although there's certainly some guessing for sure. And we know that pandemics can interrupt supply chains, and we've learned some interesting things this year. However, during that time period, they were just making stuff, and they kept making a whole bunch of stuff because they figured people will always buy stuff. It's what we do here. So, or in the whole world, the whole Western world during that time period. So they continued to produce large amounts of consumer goods that nobody was buying. And then inventories continued to increase. And eventually, kind of all about the same time when the German economy is crashing and, people are noticing that their stocks are overvalued and they'd rather sell them than buy them. We're also noticing that we have a whole massive stockpile of consumer goods that nobody's buying. So then companies start laying people off as well. You've got a fairly complicated set of problems in the economic sector that lead to the Great Depression. Now, I would also, and I've kind of directed you this way in the question, talk about laws or absence of laws that maybe made this possible. Because the stock trading things and the bank regulation things are kind of a problem. The other part of the question is to talk about government responses before 1932, which we'll talk about here in a second. And that is primarily Herbert Hoover. Now, I know, I didn't really put much of this in my notes at all for this chapter. There's a little bit, I think, at the beginning. I'm scrolling down. Yep. A little bit at the beginning of the next chapter, but your textbook, I promise you, your textbook at the very end of chapter 20 has really good information about this. So you're going to be fine. Look at the end of the textbook, but chapter 20. But government responses, Herbert Hoover. Sometimes Herbert Hoover is sort of painted as the guy who just said, it'll get better. We're not going to do anything about it. But he did do some stuff about it. Now, he did think, as the Secretary of Commerce throughout the 1920s, that it was just part of a business cycle. It always had been, and there would be a low part of the business cycle where things would decline, and then they would naturally pick up. And, you know, that's just the way the economy works. So it's normal stuff, only this time it didn't fix itself because the hole was so deep and it was so global, and it was based on very unusual conditions as well. And the way the economy worked had changed so much. But anyway, so Herbert Hoover is concerned that if we give too much public assistance, and the book does a really good job talking about the difficulties of public assistance in chapter 21, the New Deal chapter, and about how different types of public assistance were seen as more acceptable than other types. And it's interesting and sad all at the same time. But Herbert Hoover thought that if we just gave out stuff to people, they would become lazy, and that they wouldn't want to work. Now, the problem during this era, the late 20s through the 30s, is not necessarily that people don't want to work. It's not even like, I think we have this problem in the Austin area where people want to work, but it's hard to find a job that fits what your education is or what your desired job goal was. So, so you don't necessarily want to take a job that isn't what you're trained for. That is not the issue during this time period. The issue during this time period is there's no job. There's just no job. So it doesn't matter. I mean, even if you were willing to do anything in the world to work, there were no jobs available because the economy was so bad during this time period. So Herbert Hoover's thought was, if we give out too much stuff, free stuff, people just will go like, I'm just going to take the free stuff and never go back to work. There is no work to go back to, was the issue in 29 and 30. So he wanted to create programs that he thought would stimulate the economy without making individuals dependent on the government. Now, you have to remember as well that this is still an era where no one really believes it's the government's job to fix the economy. Now, we'd gone through that progressive era where we thought it might be okay for the government, to help out when there were some issues that they could fix, but not to completely fix the economy or completely support people, that sort of thing. So what Herbert Hoover designs is, goodness, I'm going to scroll down because I know I'm going to say the wrong stuff. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Federal Farm Bureau. So Reconstruction Finance Corporation was supposed to give money to businesses so that they would not fire their employees. It's sort of like the most recent, I'm sorry, I just can't think of stuff this morning. I blame the surgery. I don't know if that's fair though. The Small Business Recovery Act, the Recovery Act, yes, the Recovery Act, where the federal government gave out billions of dollars to businesses so that they would stay open, paycheck protection, that sort of stuff. I'm not really on the notes, but I'll show you the notes. Let me do that. Okay. All right, back to the notes. So yeah, because the end of my 20s notes really was just the Harlem Renaissance, but I kind of reflected back here at the beginning of the New Deal chapter. So here's what I was talking about. It's over here somewhere. Oh, here we go. So Reconstruction Finance Corporation is created during Hoover's administration, and that was to give businesses money so that they would keep their employees. What they really did was kind of buy up their own stocks, and they've kept firing employees. They also created the Federal Farm Bureau during the Hoover administration, Federal Farm Bureau, and this was to give farmers an opportunity to get money, get loans, to help pay off their farms so that they would not have to fire employees and they could continue producing, that sort of thing. And that really only helped farmers who already were probably not hurting so much. So you were only eligible for Federal Farm Bureau assistance if you were the landowner. And as you remember maybe from a previous chapter, almost everybody in the South was a sharecropper. So what you're going to see is a whole bunch of those folks just completely out of work. So they're going to try to relocate to urban areas to find jobs where there are no jobs. And if they're from the Midwest, where I was from, all of those people will try to, from Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas, those people, maybe West Texas as, little, as well, but not as much. You'll see all those folks try to go to California to get jobs in California where the farmland is still more productive, because they also have the Dust Bowl during this time period. This is a crappy time to live. I'm not going to lie. This is just, if you're ever feeling a little sad about, how life's going now, just go back and look at this time period. And, they have the Great Depression, and then they have World War II. So it's a rough time period in this era. All right, what are you saying? Oh, no. Yeah, and I get that sometimes you guys get booted out and have to get back in, so sorry for you. All right, so Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Federal Farm Bureau were the two major programs, and that honestly was more than any president had done before to try to jumpstart the economy. It just wasn't terribly effective. The other thing that Hoover did a little bit of, FDR will do a bunch more of, is public works projects. And the big one that Herbert Hoover does is what becomes the Hoover Dam. They called it Boulder Dam at first, but that's the thing over Northern California, Southern Nevada, near Las Vegas. So if your parents ever took you to Las Vegas when you were a kid and you couldn't really do anything, although that's different now, I think, they took you on a tour of the Hoover Dam. And that was created during this time period. Hoover's really associated with the prosperity of the 20s as the Secretary of Commerce, but then when the economy crashes, which happens the year after he takes office, he's really associated with the collapse of the economy after that. So it's kind of rough. All right. So your goal for the weekly question, causes of the Great Depression. You look at the end of chapter 20, even though it's not necessarily in the end of my notes, but the last like 3 or 4 pages of chapter 20 in your textbook have really good information that will help you on this. There's a little bit of information in my notes, but this is a little bit more you and the book becoming friends, okay? I would talk about the stock market. I would talk about agricultural industries declining. I would talk about consumerism, but then I would talk about overproduction. Don't forget that there's global problems with the economy, because once the German economy collapses, there's going to be problems in Europe. And because the markets are interrelated during this time period, it's a problem. Now, most people, I'm sure you probably recognize, most people were not, Hoover Dam is a good field trip. Most people are not involved in stock market directly during this time period. I think most people are a little more indirectly now. When you have a professional job, usually you get some sort of retirement package which is invested in the stock market. So you may not personally, but your company is, so you probably pay a little attention later on, who knows. But during this time period, the 20s and 30s, the average person isn't buying stocks. If the average person has a bank account, which they probably do during this time period, they're just depositing their check, and then they take out money when they need it. However, or their pay, they're probably getting checks at this point. However, most banks were loaning money to stockbrokers who loaned money to people who invested recklessly. So when the stock market crashed, a bunch of people defaulted on the loans that they had used to borrow stocks. And then the banks ended up collapsing because they had made those unsafe, unsecured loans. So people who had never invested in stocks at all lost all their money because they put their money in a bank, because the bank had given out unwise investments. deposits or unwise loans. So banks don't do that anymore. Well, they still make probably unwise decisions, but they're insured now. During this time period, there was no FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures your bank deposits up to a certain amount. So what happens in the 20s economically is going to lead to the economic reforms, of the 1930s, and also is going to lead to a whole different way for people in the United States to view the role of the government when we have a crisis. Yeah, which really is your weekly question for next week. How does the New Deal change how we see the government's role in crisis? That's not exactly the question, but that's kind of the question. So this week's question was, describe the causes of the Great Depression. Be specific and detailed in this discussion. What laws or absence of laws might have set the conditions for this event? What were the government responses to the Depression before 1932, and were they effective? And you can say they were or weren't effective, but just say how you measure that, because you could easily say they weren't effective because the Depression didn't end. That's fair. But you could also say that they were effective in some ways because we did get the Hoover Dam, and some people kept their companies and some people got jobs, but it doesn't make the entire economy recover, and it surely didn't end the Great Depression. One of the things I noticed as I was very slowly grading is that some of you are maybe not answering all of the parts of the question. I don't know if the question is just too long or you go like, nah, I don't care about that. If I ask you something, if you don't mind putting it in there, I'd probably give you more points. So on this one, there's lots of little parts of it. So make sure that you talk about the government responses to the Depression and if they were effective. That's the part I'm afraid you may overlook. All right, I think we're gonna probably stop for I need to finish roll, but I'll stop recording and let's see if you guys have questions.